Good morning and welcome to Brave New World, the annual conference for people who are curious about what the future has in store. Together, we'll explore different scenarios and see how big tech trends or other trends are impacting the way we do business, the way we live our lives. And of course, we'll talk about the impact that has on governance, on policy, on the ethical and societal aspects. That is what Brave New World makes unique. It's an annual conference that used to be a very intimate setting in Leiden with a broad range of thought leaders, and now we try to recreate this intimate setting here in the studio thanks to the help of our friends at Live Legends. So this is a very special edition of Brave New World. It's the open session. Thanks to our friends at the European Parliament, this is a session that anyone can join, anyone can participate in. And we're going to talk about equality, inequality, depends on how you read it. And I think that I speak on behalf of many people that I say that this weekend when I woke up, I felt a bit more happy, a bit more hopeful perhaps because of the elections in the US, perhaps with the President-elect Biden and his Vice President Harris, we feel a bit more that we're living in a world that is just, a bit more fair, friendly even. And when you think about it, these are European values, right? Liberté, égalité, fraternité. And this session, we're going to focus on the second part, égalité, or in Dutch, equality. We're going to talk about how this big technological trend, artificial intelligence, is impacting the equality and the inequality. And the way we do that is a panel discussion. In a few moments, I will introduce my three experts, the panel members, and of course, you can join this discussion as well. You can use Mentimeter for that. I will tell you how in a few moments. First, let me introduce our first guest, because she is a member of the European Parliament, where she focuses on the Committee on Employment and Social Affairs, and her name is Kim van SPARRENTAK. Let's see if we have a connection with Kim. Hi, Kim.
Hi.
Yes, we can hear each other. I think that is the sentence that is being heard all around the world. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, yes, you can hear me okay? Yes?
Perfect, yeah. So glad that you are able to join us to talk about this topic of equality/inequality. For those people who don't know, as I said, you are a member of the European Parliament, and you're busy with the Committee on Employment and Social Affairs. How would you describe the work of that committee?
How to describe it? Well, we're trying to create a more social Europe. So we're working really hard to make that happen.
Yeah, that sounds like a big mission.
Yes, it is, but
Yeah,
it's a good one.
it's a good one. And the topic of today is how artificial intelligence plays a part in this big mission. Was AI already a part of your daily interest a few years ago, or is that something of the last couple of months or years, perhaps?
Well, I've for many years been a fighter for equality and freedom. And one of the things we see is that, the emergence of new technologies is really can be a catalyst in creating more equality and also in creating more inequality.
Right,
And that's why it has, very organically become part of my daily work.
right. So it wasn't at day one, but it is now.
Exactly. Yeah. No. Day one was me standing in the fields in protests, and it has evolved towards where I am right now. And that's why I also am very happy to be a member of the new Committee on Artificial Intelligence in a Digital Age in the European Parliament, where we are discussing the future of technology and artificial intelligence.
Oh, wow. That is a new committee?
It's a special committee that was set up specifically to discuss the future of artificial intelligence and digital technologies. Yes.
Right, yeah. Is this like a follow-up of the high-level expert group that almost had the same name?
You could say it, but now it's being put together by members of the European Parliament.
All right, cool. Again, thank you for joining us. Our second panelist is Assistant Professor Multi-Actor Systems at Delft Technical University, and her name is SEDA GÜRSES. Hi, SEDA. The same question for you. Can you hear us okay? Okay, well, I see you are smiling, but I don't hear your voice. I'm sure that we're working on the audio issues as we're speaking. I think the panel is multidisciplinary. As I said, we have someone who feels very at home in the political arena, and now we have someone more from the technical side. Technical University Delft is also famous for its work in the field of AI and ethics. SEDA, how would you describe your research?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay,
Yes.
perfect. Great. Wonderful. Yeah, I'm a computer scientist and I ask about how we can put the right values into the systems that we build. And my work focused for a long time on how we can make sure that developers do the right thing. However, I started to understand that the computational infrastructures and even the AI interfaces limit what the developers can do. So I started studying the political economy of big tech and the computational infrastructures we have today.
Ah, okay. So when we talk about multi-actor, we're not talking about agents, artificial agents. You talk about stakeholders.
I am talking about stakeholders, including the infrastructure that we use to develop the technologies we have today. So we cannot just develop AI, but we actually depend on both anywhere from really expensive chips, which are provided through cloud providers, which is in the hands of a few companies right now, as well as APIs, which allow us to do AI. So we're very dependent on this infrastructure. So if you want, you can call the infrastructure a stakeholder, but we should not limit ourselves to only human stakeholders because this is a very powerful actor in the scene.
That's true. And what I really like about Delft is that it isn't just the technical university, it's also designing for values, right? To have the ethics also on the design, in the design phase already.
That's correct. And I think what we're running into is that the design phase is already very limited by the infrastructures that we have. And AI itself has a lot of values of centralized control and optimization built into its logic. And so when we subscribe to AI, we subscribe to these values. So what does that mean in terms of how many of our public values we can negotiate using these systems?
All right. Okay. Also for you, thanks for joining us. And our third panelist, his name is RUDY van BELKOM. He is a researcher, a futures researcher, and he works at the Netherlands Study Center for Technology Trends, and he is here in the studio. Hi, RUDY.
Hello.
Good to see you.
Thank you.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you very loud and clear.
Thank God.
Yes.
You are a futures researcher.
Yes, that's correct.
So what do you do from 9 to 5 on a daily,
on a daily basis? Well,
yeah.
I work for the Netherlands Study Center for Technology Trends, and our main goal is to make society future ready. Because when we look at our educational system, we have a lot of history, but not so much future. And I think future literacy is what you could call it. I think we try to help and make society more future ready. And my personal role as a researcher is trying to find out what the impact of technology on our society is. So we both look at technology, but also at the soft side and the impact. So we try to create scenarios, different scenarios, because I cannot predict the future. So if people think, okay, he's got this crystal ball and that's my job, no. In English, it's futures researcher. So there's not one future. So we're trying to explore different possible future scenarios. And AI obviously has a big impact on our future. And it's very important to look ahead, not because we're trying to predict the future, but because we have to anticipate now. So AI is not like a future myth or something. I mean, inequality is happening right now as we speak.
Yes. And in 2019, you published a study on artificial intelligence.
Yes.
Was inequality already a part of that study?
Yeah, great part. And I also published a book about it. It's called AI No Longer as a Plug. And it's also about how can we act now in order to get like more ethical systems in the future. And inequality is, you could translate it into fairness, justice, etc. And it's a big part of the study because I think AI is one of the technologies that impacts inequality most of all technologies we have. So important business, important stuff.
And this is why we are here with this panel. As I said, if you're watching at home, perhaps at your kitchen table, in bed, in the living room, I don't know, just lock the door, put on your headphones and join this discussion. You can do so using Mentimeter. And of course, I'm sure you do a lot of webinars, you know you need a code. The code that you need for this Mentimeter is 9406774. Let me repeat that. Mentimeter 9406774. That way you can become part of the conversation. So if you have questions, remarks, or you want to pay compliments, feel free to do so using Mentimeter. And I would really like to hear your voice in this little poll that we're going to conduct right now. The question that I would like you to answer is, did inequality rise in the last 30 years? And there are three options. A, yes, there is more inequality now. B, no, it declined. And the third option, it remains the same. So the question, the poll is, did inequality, in your opinion, rise in the last 30 years? Yes, no, These are your three options. And let me ask this very question first to Kim. Kim, what do you think? Did inequality rise?
I think when we look at the statistics, at least when it comes to economic inequality, it has been rising like crazy in the last 30 years. Yes. Okay. So I mean, wealthy people just get wealthier at the moment. So I think it's very clear that inequality is rising.
Right. And then you say the richer people are getting richer. Isn't it the case that 30 years ago there were just many more people who had a very low income and that are now being paid fairly?
Yeah, of course, we see a general increase in more people getting paid more, but the inequality is still growing. I mean, we have so many billionaires right now and so many people living under the poverty line that this inequality in itself is growing.
Right. And SEDA, what do you think? Do you agree with Kim?
Yes, I absolutely agree. I think economically speaking, we actually even see the impact of this on the cloud infrastructures. I think after 2008 financial breakdown, the investors had to move in somewhere and they actually moved into tech companies. This is why we have tech companies that are even dominating the S&P 500. So we have a few companies that have enormous economic power and wealth, and their funds are funneled through the less than 1% who have too much money and need to invest it somewhere, and they've gone to tech. So one of the reasons we have humongous cloud infrastructures is because of the inequality in the world.
Rudy, I dare to ask.
The answer is yes,
yes?
Obviously.
Okay.
But I think we don't even need to look at the past 30 years. We can also look at the past 6 months. I mean, COVID situation makes clear that especially social inequality is rising. So as it turns out, the more poorer regions of the world are infected more by the virus than the more richer parts of the world. And people with less resources typically have less health, have less possibilities to work from home, live in more crowded environments. So I think we also have to look at social inequality, not only about income inequality, but also social. And when you look at digital inequality, I mean, at the first wave in March, we had, in Holland at least, people had to work from home, students had to study from home, kids had to stay at home. So if you don't have enough digital resources, you get behind. Right. So I think there's a gap, and the gap is getting bigger at people being disadvantaged with less resources. So that's also a thing we need to look at, I guess.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And I think so far, the majority of people who are watching at home in their pajamas, they agree with you. They say, yes, inequality has risen in the last 30 years. And Kim, you focus on the financial equality. Rudy makes a valid point about digital equality. I could play the role of the devil's advocate and say that 30 years ago, I, as a teenager, didn't have the opportunity that my sons, who are now teenagers, have. Because anyone with an internet connection has this level playing field to start a business, to hear, to let his voice or her voice be heard. So I would say that the internet is also a big contributor in leveling the playing field.
Yeah, we know that at least, you know, for to be able to require information, that is partially true. But to start a business, you need a starting capital. So that is definitely not the case that
To start a
that
business, you
there's a
don't
level
need
playing
capital. You
field
just
there.
need a WordPress website and an Instagram account with a lot of followers. The e-commerce platform is already there.
Yeah, but you can buy them, eh? So that's still not
Okay,
a
you
level
need.
playing field. And I
Mhm.
think in general, what we see is that the way that the algorithms work, for example, on social media, and the way that, you know, discussions and debates are being held, and what we're seeing is that that extreme content is being promoted by these algorithms, which actually pushes away people from minorities, and people who are less advantaged from these social media platforms, or at least you see that there is a greater fear in participating in these debates because of the way they are being treated online. And I think that's a very worrisome thing. The big promise of the internet and social media being a place where everyone can participate in debates in a fair way is just not true, because we see that there's actually a lot of discrimination happening on these platforms.
Hmm. And SEDA, so Kim's point is, although I asked about e-commerce, she says, well, if you look at all these algorithms, they are increasing polarization, for example, in social media. And then sometimes if you read the press, the media, the algorithms get blamed for that. Do you think that is a valid point?
I think the work that I do tries not to look just at algorithms, but the production of these systems and what kind of new set of values and institutions they create. So I think it's very interesting to see that in the 90s and maybe even to the 2000s, we talked about inclusion as a desirable property to remove inequalities. But right now, the communities that are most affected by the inequalities in the world say that being part of the internet and being part of the services that we have today, which create inequalities, is a sort of predatory inclusion. So to be included means that they might be controlled more or might be put in a worse position. And these people do not necessarily have even the chance to have entrepreneurial ambitions, because most likely they're going to become gig workers with less labor rights than we have today.
And of which people are you talking about that run this risk? Is that just anyone with an internet connection?
I think that actually a good number of the communities that we have been looking at do not even have internet connection, but at times they're refusing this connection because they think that the only way they will be included is as very cheap labor, or as people are bullied or polarized on these platforms, or that may be profiled to the extent that the access to resources they will have will be decided algorithmically, which typically does not necessarily decide in their advantage.
Well, you're smiling, but you're also being pessimistic.
I mean, I think it's interesting to think about pessimism and optimism in this case, because what happens if we are restructuring organizations that stratify society in a way which determines people's life chances in a way that we're not used to, right? Like we used to have democratic processes and access to education, but with online education, as Kim also underlined, and you also talked about, access to education is becoming very luxury. People who have a lot of money get to go to classrooms that are, you know, supported with extra teachers, understanding that we need more support right now, whereas those who do not have access to such funds or luxury institutions are on online, not necessarily using educational tools like we use Zoom, which is a business tool, to educate them. And I think this already creates a different class of education for those who have the means and those who do not. So this is for the people who have internet, but you have to imagine all those who do not have internet are currently not getting access to education at all. So we see a stratification through the way in which technology is organized across society.
Yeah, and
we would like to change that. I mean, it sounds pessimistic, but we want to change that, right?
And Rudy, rest assured, I'll come to you about this topic. It's just that it strikes me that both SEDA and Kim are saying that the internet gives us more inequality, yet the arguments that you both bring across, it looks like you're talking about the old world, right? Education, a college degree, going to a posh school or an Ivy League, while there's also this thing called Khan Academy or the National AI course, which are all free. And are intended to bring anyone, no matter how much money your parents make, this part of education that happens to be online. So it's free and it's accessible.
Well, it's accessible if you speak English, if you know how to study, and if you don't have the time to actually sit behind a computer and not have to work 60 hours a week as a gig worker because your salary from one job doesn't pay the bills. I mean, that is the crude reality for so many people right now. So it's still a sense of privilege if you are able to enjoy these online classes, for example.
Yeah, and I think we need to think about what it means for these services to be free. They do use compute, so somebody has to pay for it, right? And how is it that it's very difficult to give free education, even if we have public funding like we do in the Netherlands? And to call this free, we have to ask who is paying for it and at what cost. And actually right now we have to ask the question, what does it mean to put universities in competition with services that have venture capital backing and access to clouds at a cost that we don't know who's paying for? What is the long-term effect of that is going to be very interesting to look at.
All right. Rudy, so much to digest. What are your first thoughts here?
Well, I think it's important to look at the access to resources, the access to internet, language barriers, etc. But we also need to take a look at the system itself, what we're creating and who is creating it. Because inequality is more than just access to resources. I guess when we look at what we are creating biased systems, right? So garbage in, garbage out. So a lot of data we use, it's not sufficient because some parts are missing. It's not complete. So we get, well, we don't have neutral technologies as a result. But the interesting part, I guess, here is, for example, you had Amazon who tried to use an application algorithm to find better for job applications, right?
Yeah,
so
for the hiring process.
For the hiring process, right? So media, etc., they said, okay, this algorithm is sexist because it had a preference for male candidates. But I don't think the algorithm is sexist, our society is, right? Because it looked at data from the past 10 years, and as it turns out, more male candidates were successful. So the algorithm thought, okay, then males are more successful. So what is sexist? Is it our society or is it the algorithm? I guess to believe, or I tend to believe that it's more the problem of society rather than of the algorithm. And we also need to take a look at who is creating it, because there is not a lot of diversity within programmers, etc. They also call it AI's white guy problem, right? Because a lot of white guys are the programmers of these different algorithms. So I guess we also need to take a look at inequality in that specific area, right? How can we create more diversity in people who are programming it, but also regulating it? So there are a lot of different ethical guidelines at the moment, over 100. You called the high-level expert group of the European Commission, that's one of them. But there are more. A university from Zurich, they researched 84 different guidelines. And as it turns out, of those 84 guidelines, the diversity in countries which publish them is really thin. So most of them come from America, Europe, and Japan. So even in a discussion about what we think is important, so we talk about fairness and equality, etc., but it's more or less a Western perspective. So also that discussion is not inclusive. So there are a lot of different things, and we focus now on the access to resources. Big problem, very important, but there's a lot more.
It's a lot more. Kim, if I paraphrase Rudy's words a little bit, he says the algorithms are not biased or increasing inequality. AI is like a mirror of society. It just shows us what was already wrong, so we should work on how to fix that. And as I listened to you in your introduction, that is something that you are working on. Can you tell us why you're optimistic that will work, or how you're going to approach this?
Well, I think one of the things that we really have to look at is the databases that are being used. And very often we use databases from, very credible sources, the Central Bureau of Statistics in the Netherlands. But since there's every person, is raised with a certain bias, We know that also what is collected by these, very, well-known statistical databases, bureaus is biased in a way. And the problem is that AI then, as Rudy just said, thinks, oh, that is the way it is, because AI doesn't, can't create context. AI just says, okay, A plus B is C. Well, actually, it says a lot of more calculations, but just to explain it. Anyway, so when we have a Dutch Central Bureau of Statistics that categorizes whether a neighborhood is good based on how many people with a migrant background live there, we have a very big problem, because that is being put in an algorithm that then thinks that's the truth. And if we base whatever we do in our society on these algorithms, then we see huge issues coming up. We had a very recent example in the Netherlands where a Dutch fraud risk assessment system produced very discriminatory results on who had a high risk to commit fraud, basically because people with a migration background were the ones that were usually targeted. And then now the algorithm thinks that they have a higher chance to commit fraud. And it was completely untransparent and uncontrollable by legislators to see how this actually happened. So I think it's a very big problem that we need to fix in all roots of society, but we have to especially make sure that AI doesn't increase the problems.
Right, and we just heard that Zurich research shows that there were 84 ethical
well, there
guidelines?
are more, but they selected 84 from governments and corporates, etc.
Is that helpful that there are so many? Is that a good sign?
Well, I guess it's better than to have none. I mean, the ethical guidelines are a very good starting point. And I strongly believe that, the principles that they lay down, such as human oversight, transparency, accountability, and, very important, non-discrimination is really good. I just think that only having guidelines is not enough. We really should be able to enforce these principles, and we cannot rely on just asking the most powerful companies in the world nicely to respect our fundamental rights, because we know protecting our fundamental rights is not their first priority. It's making money.
Yes.
So I really believe that our EU standards should be enforceable, and companies should be held accountable if they do not adhere to these guidelines.
Right. So fairness, unbiased, just these are big words, but it's just like world peace. Everybody wants it. But the real question is, how do we get there? And you say standards. Are you talking about like a GDPR on ethical guidelines, something that can be reinforced?
Well, I do really think that the EU can be, as we are with the GDPR, really a world leader in safe and ethical innovation when we have very clear rules, because then we can guarantee that technology is safe, it serves the people and society. And importantly, we can also create consumer trust. So I think we should really ensure that, companies know what they have to do. And to next to that, we also have to set standards on the data that we are sharing, and make sure that there's also a level playing field for companies to have non-personal data available to them, especially when it comes to things that can be good for our society, like health data or data related to the energy systems. Then we really can try to make sure that Europe becomes a leader in ethical, innovative AI.
Right. And in the end, world peace.
Yes, that's
Yes.
always the end goal, of course.
It is. SEDA, is it possible to design an AI system that is unbiased?
I think that's a very interesting question. First of all, I think this idea that we can have an unbiased society suggests that we have ended politics somehow to a great extent.
Yeah.
So I don't know what it means to aspire for a world that doesn't have politics anymore. I think we want to have change, and change comes through asking for different things in the future. And so this idea of an unbiased data set or an unbiased algorithm, and I don't think that all problems are just about data sets and algorithms mirroring us, is a bit of a fantasy. And in fact, it has become a blockage for people who are now trying to do politics on asking for more equality or less stratification through technology, where policymakers will say, well, sure, we'll just unbias the data set. But that doesn't make sense. So let me just give you an example. We have a master's student, very talented one, that recently looked at how Airbnb might be increasing gentrification in Amsterdam. And what happened is that by virtue of looking at the data set that's available from Airbnb, he could only look at neighborhoods that already had Airbnb. And it turns out that that left behind all of the neighborhoods with low-income people, immigrants, and Black people. So that means that the study already assumed that economic activity is concentrated where Airbnb is active, and that's where we should be studying and looking for impacts like inequality or gentrification in this case. So we see how both the data and the activities of these tech companies focus our eyes and attention and policies to certain parts of the city versus the parts that are maybe most needing attention and support. So I think you can't unbias a data set if it already is biased in terms of the focus it has on the world.
So it's not possible to design an AI system that is unbiased? Because
no, I think an AI system should be open to political contestation. And in fact, what AI systems do is they centralize decision making and allow for top-down policy making. And that at the hands of a few companies, or sometimes centralized through one company that scales services to multiple municipalities, let's say, which makes contestation individually, but even by the municipalities, very, very difficult. So one of the things we've been looking at is the use of Waze, which is a traffic beating app. I don't know if people use it in the Netherlands as much as in the US and elsewhere. But just imagine a navigation app that says if you can go from A to B faster if you just get off the freeway and use surface roads. The impact that this has had is quite tremendous on surface roads, especially smaller roads with schools, et cetera, where they get a lot of traffic and a lot of accidents and general safety concerns. And traffic engineers have also shown that applications like Waze actually increase overall congestion while maybe benefiting a few users. And municipalities have spoken with Waze saying, can you take some of these roads off because they're dangerous? Yeah. You know, you're actually affecting public safety. And Waze can just go, you're one municipality among thousands that we serve. Why should we even respond? So this is the kind of new governance structure that AI makes possible. And so if we cannot politically contest and change processes, or our democratic institutions cannot even contest them, if a municipality cannot question how their traffic is being re-engineered by a third party, I think we have a problem that is much more than debiasing data sets.
All right. Rudy, if I had to choose between an algorithm or 100% randomness, I would probably go for the algorithm.
Me too. Depends. Well, can I react to the?
Yes, please.
What they said. Well, what Kim said. I'm a believer of regulations. You know, I'm in favor of it. I mean, all these companies, it's becoming a wild west, or in a way, right? Because if it's not regulated, all these big techs with a lot of power, they can do whatever they like. So yes, we need regulations, legislation. At the same time, I have some doubts about the applicability of those different regulations, because, like you call them, they are feel-good principles. Of course, we all want fairness and transparency and privacy and save the world, of course. But the main question is, how can we integrate them into the systems? Because it depends on a lot of factors. First of all, context. For example, privacy, it depends in what context is being used. Small example, if I go to the doctor and he says to undress, I'm like, fair enough, right? I'm in a doctor's appointment. If the baker asks me to do the same thing, I'm like, that's completely invasive of my privacy, right? So context is really important. Another factor that it's mostly, well, disregarded in a way, there are different stakeholder perspectives. So it depends if I'm a user of an algorithm, the programmer of an algorithm, the insurer of an algorithm, the legislator of an algorithm, we all have different interests. That's a good thing, but just to say privacy, transparency, fairness, it's too generic. We need to make different specifications depending on the context, depending on the stakeholder. And when you look at regulations from the European Commission, they say, quote, all principles are of equal importance. But in practice, that will never work, because if we want 100% privacy, and we want 100% transparency, there are some trade-offs. So technical trade-offs, because systems, it's still mathematics, you know, it's still about statistics. There'll still be uncertainties. Do we accept false positive? Do we accept false negatives?
Yep.
And in what relation? Transparency, privacy, how do we relate to each other? And how do we weigh those different factors? So I guess an answer that needs to be, or a question that needs to be asked is, how can AI systems learn what is and is not ethical? Because if we only stick to principles, we can't really program principles in a system, because reality is way more complex. So you can't say, okay, in this situation you need to do this, in this situation. It's too complex. Humans, as humans, I mean, I can drive using rules, like I have traffic rules, right?
Yeah.
But the final step, I mean, for example, I'm allowed to drive 100 kilometers an hour in the Netherlands. But I don't always drive 100 kilometers an hour. It depends on the context, traffic, etc. So there are different interests, even with a simple task as driving. So I really believe, yes, look at regulations like an important first step, but also how can we integrate it instead of only evaluating it? So that's a remark I would like to make. And your question was, if I had to make a decision, right?
My question is, have you ever ordered a loaf of bread at your doctor's?
No, of course. I mean, it's simplified, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, but it just shows with a simple example that things like privacy, things like fairness, it depends on the context, big time. And it also is cultural, right? So what we think is privacy, maybe in the East they say, for us this is different. Not per se bad, because it's really a Western perspective that we say, okay, in China they lost their mind. The other way around is also true. They think we lost our mind. I mean, it's not like true or false. We need to look at the different perspectives.
My questions are irrelevant. There was a beautiful answer. So thank you. Kim, I'm looking at the new Mentimeter poll. This was done by AI because I didn't announce it. It just magically emerged. The question is, are technological innovations making us more unequal? So the focus here is on technology. The first question was more general. And then most people say yes, although less people than did with the first poll. My question to you is a point that Rudy brings up, is the way we look at these issues in the Western world versus perhaps the way they look at this in the Eastern world, let's say China. And then Rudy says, perhaps we think they lost their mind and they think we lost our mind. What shifts do you see? Are we becoming more China-like, or is China becoming more Western-like?
I have no idea. You know, I have a very Western perspective, being from the Netherlands. But what we do see, of course, is that you know, there are two very big digital powers right now. We have the US and we have China, and Europe is also trying really hard to be one of them.
Stuck in the middle.
And we see that, you know, in China, you know, fundamental rights, we know that they're not very well taken care of, and that most of the companies there are really being overseen by the government. Which is not a very democratic government. Then we have the US, where we have very big corporations that just have all the freedom and have a lot of, you know, money invested into them by perhaps slightly doubtful companies, and then and they just want to make profit. So what we can do as Europe is really try to create our own you know, bubble of digital companies that do try to adhere to fundamental rights, that do try, you know, to have a more ethical approach toward digitization. And if we manage to become a world leader in that sense, you know, where we really try to get rid of as much bias as possible, try to be as transparent as possible, and also just regulate these big companies. Like, we're not dependent on Facebook. We don't need Facebook. You know, we will still live if we don't have Facebook. But the way they are trying to, you know, lobby against the EU, threatening to not give us Facebook anymore, you know, I mean, it will be sad for some people that really like it, but it's not like, you know, we won't have food on the table if we don't have Facebook anymore. So I think we really have to make sure that we have, you know, our own values and put them more on towards the US and Chinese companies.
And do you see an example of this? Is there a European company that actually has a tremendous market and that respects these values that you hold up so dear?
Well, I think the main problem is that we don't have these giants. We don't have that many giants yet, but there are a lot of great initiatives in Europe that are really trying, you know, to get into the market. But the problem is that because these big corporations own all the data, it's very hard to push through. But we do see that that the atmosphere is changing and that more companies are trying to be set up. Unfortunately, we also see that then as soon as a company becomes, you know, bigger, then Google buys them, and then they're Google's again. So it's a bit of a catch-22 situation.
That's interesting because I was going to say the reason there is no European Facebook is not because Facebook is lobbying. It's just because there is not one Europe. It's very hard to create one tool for a market that doesn't exist.
Well, I don't believe the European market doesn't exist. And next to that, I mean, Facebook is worldwide. So they managed. So I don't think that's the problem.
That's true. I was just trying to play devil's advocate here. SEDA.
I'm pretty sure for a Monday morning.
SEDA, question for you. As you are from the Technical University of Delft, TU Delft, we say, of course, you want to design a system that's better than the old design. Then the real question, of course, is how do we make equality measurable? Because that would be a great output of your system to see how are we doing.
Right. I mean, I think it's a very contestable thing to think that we can measure equality instead of asking people whether they're doing better or not. I mean, in a sense, I think tech companies have put forth this idea that they're better arbiters of democratic, let's say, progress because they have so many data points, right? But I think we know that a lot of people use these systems sometimes because they really want to use them the way they do, but in many times they're compelled to use them. Like try not being on Facebook or trying not being on LinkedIn and to get a job, right? Or at this point, there are so few jobs, and with the economic downturn that's maybe potentially to be expected with COVID, a lot of people are going to be moving towards gig works because that's an easy way to earn a few bucks, right? And so I think this idea that we can just rely on data points to decide whether, or we can measure in that sense, whether there is inequality and contestation is only through data sets, delivers us to a utilitarian logic where we can say, on average, we're doing better. But what happens to the minorities or those voices that are either not represented in those data points or are not even worth considering because they're a small population, right? Like the concept of fundamental right is that you protect every individual, but a utilitarian logic that says for the majority, we're doing better. Well, there's this community that we totally messed up with, but you know, because the majority counts more in our data set, then we can just say we did better. So I think the measurement thing is very interesting to explore how a system is doing internally, but it doesn't give you a picture of how that system is maybe causing externalities to other parts of society. And I think how we evaluate that is a great challenge that I hope more researchers will be working on.
Right. So if the question is how do we make equality measurable, you say that is not the right question. We should ask many people, many different people, the question, are you better off now than you was a year ago? Is that your answer?
I am saying that platforms provide suggestions like fairness, which is a very, very reduced identification of what it means to have equality in society, right? It first of all assumes that you know that these systems are only used for decision making, which is not true. They're also used to reorder our environment and what resources are available to us. Second, they assume that decisions are causal. So because I made a decision, now you're impacted through the system in a way that causes disparate treatment. So it's inequality is very causal. Well, oftentimes inequality happens because multiple decisions are made, and down the line, you have a very bad impact on a certain population. And finally, a lot of the ways in which measurement is proposed right now assumes that if we have some sort of parity across attributes, so if let's say Black people or people with immigrant background are treated the same as white people in a system, that we have equality. So these are the kind of measurement proposals that are going around. So I'm being very concrete, right? And these do not allow for those communities to speak up and say, both your conception of measurement does not apply to my context, as Rudy was putting out earlier, context really matters, but I also want to contest your measurement. And they can say, well, my population is doing better. The fact that you're not doing well, I don't care, because overall my numbers look good. That is the kind of scenario we do not want to have. We want it possible that even smaller minorities who are being impacted by technologies or by institutions in very, very bad ways have the possibility to raise and contest these systems. And currently, I wouldn't say that is possible.
Rudy, your thoughts?
Well, I think we also need to take a look at what is equality exactly. And you could call it semantics, but I mean, for example, men and women, we are not identical, but we should be equal. So equality is not being identical, it's being equal. Means being given the same rights. But at the same time, we also need to make a difference between equality and equity in terms of justice. So where equality says, okay, everyone gets the same, equity looks at the different needs and tries to work for a fair outcome. So I agree with Kim, I agree with SEDA. At the same time, I still am a big thinker about, or we should think bigger about how. Because we know what we want, still it's not that clear because, like I said, what is equality exactly and what is a desirable outcome? So for example, when you Googled a few years ago, you Googled CEO, you got white males. If you Google it now, you also get females. Right. So that's an improvement, right? But when we look at reality, now Google shows more females than in reality CEO females are. So I'm a big fan of that development, but at the same time, you need to ask, does the algorithm needs to show reality or our desirability? And that is a big responsibility to make a decision like that. So we still need to answer the question, how can we make sure the algorithm is unbiased, is equal, etc. And it begins with, you could call it semantics, but it's really important to decide what is equality exactly. And then, like I said before, we need to look at ethics by design, because you can't program ethical values into the system. It's, well, most of the times when we talk about AI, it's about machine learning, so the system learns. And when we regulate things, you can regulate the first steps, maybe, but then the algorithm learns from data, and it's not the programmer's fault anymore. Right. Or you could question if it's the programmer's fault. Yeah. So in the perspective we're looking at now, I believe too much responsibility is put on the programmer, because we say, okay, we want privacy, fairness, blah, here you go, and then work it out. You know, just do it whatever you want. But there's a lot of room for interpretation now. So the question, how can we make it measurable with a mathematical system, still remains very important. And we can't duck this question like, okay, well, we know what we want. We need to specify it, because otherwise a statistical system can never be fair if you don't know what fair is to begin with.
I love it that you give this very concrete example of the CEO search at Google Images. Kim, I would say that in the past, Google, the algorithm, just looked at, I have this many photos of male CEOs, and I have this many photos of female CEOs, so I will show you photos of men. Then, as Rudy says, there was a tweak in the algorithm, because reality didn't change. They wrote rules that this would change, but they did it by themselves, perhaps because they were afraid of public opinion or other arguments. Do you think that Google or another tech company would listen to you and your colleagues if you say, well, while we're at it, we have some more requests for you to adjust your algorithms? Do you think they would listen?
Well, what we see in these big corporations is as soon as there is public outrage, they are very, very quickly changing the way that their algorithms work, and what is allowed and what is not allowed. I mean, for example, QAnon, it was already on their platforms for many years. Then there was a public outcry about it, and it was suddenly forbidden on Facebook. Of course, it really helps if it's people in the European Parliament asking for it, but we can't change the world just from the European Parliament. We need the civil society to be there with us, and luckily we see that there's a huge rise in people, fighting for their rights, their digital rights on the internet. And making sure that these big corporations are really being called out when they do something that is a-okay. So I think that is what we see. But to come back to this whole CEO point, I mean, we also know the example of the organizations that try to get what is the best CEO, or what is a CEO profile to put onto the CVs that they got. And, if you ask LinkedIn, what does a CEO look like? The first thing you get is a white male. Because that is the most common denominator that we see among CEOs in the world. So I find it interesting that you asked the question about, would you prefer, just a randomized system or AI to look at you, to Rudy? Because I think it's a very different answer depending on from which background you have, which gender you have, which sexual orientation you have, which color of skin you have, whether you would prefer an AI system or a randomized system.
Thank you. SEDA, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very interesting. We're making this assumption that data represents reality, but when Safiya Noble, a colleague of ours in the US, made a similar study and she looked for Asian women and Black women, what she found was predominantly pornographic images of these women. So I hope that we would not claim as a representation of reality, but maybe it says something about how these websites are organized or how these services are organized. So Google is not optimizing necessarily reality, but it's actually optimizing engagement, and that vis-a-vis their advertisement clientele. So the idea that we ask for representation in a system that is there to optimize for advertisement is already a mismatch, but it's kind of interesting to see, okay, that's an interesting political struggle right there. But let's like walk ourselves through how we can change this optimization, right? So we can say what Rudy proposed, that everybody sees a lot of diversity in Black women and Asian women or CEOs. So that could be one policy. Another one could be that certain populations see lots of male CEOs and certain populations see lots of women CEOs, and actually they can optimize it to your profile and decide that, you seem like a progressive, I don't know what, so you'll see more women and people of color CEOs, and you seem to be more conservative, male, whatever, and you'll just see. And that is exactly what gave us the political polarization and the kind of messiness of elections over the last years, right? It's that kind of being able to target individual users to their profiles and to give them something that matches what they think it should be an image of reality, right? But that is still an optimization process, right? And the question is, should any company have the power to set policy centrally, be it that we all see more women CEOs, or be it that we individually see different profiles of CEOs? That is huge power, and I'm not sure we really have come to grips on what to ask of these companies now that they have so much power. All we know is that we always have to ask them.
Yes, yeah. Also, thank you for highlighting the book. It's called Algorithms of Oppression, right?
That's correct,
by
yes.
Noble. Yeah,
Yes, yeah.
It's a must read. Time flies when you're talking about inequality. We have 5 minutes on the clock, and I would like to end with the third poll that we have on Mentimeter, because I really like the fact that more people in this poll said, I don't know, when the conversations took place. And now the question is, but would the world be a better place if everyone was equal? 3 options, yes, no, or that is, utopia. This situation will never occur, or perhaps dystopia. Rudy, I want to give you the first chance to answer this question. Do you think the world would be a better place if everyone was equal?
If everyone had the same opportunities and if the world was equitable, yes. So like I said before, equality, equity, there's a big difference.
Right.
So I'm not per se saying equality is not a good thing, but I think we need to specify what we exactly mean. So equitable, yes, 100%. So we need to take a look at different contexts. Like SEDA already said, who is it that you're asking the question and who is seeing the results? So if we can design diversity, we can also design unity. And if we can design polarization and opinions that go far left or far right, we can also design systems. And for example, if I like cats, of course the algorithm shows me a lot of cat movies because they want my attention,
Engagement.
right? But at the same time, you can also design a system that says, okay, you like cat movies, why not watch a dog movie for a change, right? Why not suggest an alternative? And I guess, to keep it short, we forgot one critical stakeholder. We talked about the legislator, the designer, the programmer, but we also have the user, right?
Yeah.
So I'm talking to a lot of young people right now and ask the question, how much of a responsibility do you have yourself? And I was kind of shocked maybe that they said, yes, it's also our own responsibility. We need to be more critical citizens. So there is fake news. You could say, okay, end fake news. You could also say, teach the people to identify fake news and to react respondently and check fact checking, etc., etc., etc. So,
Power to the people. Kim, I see in this poll that most people say, this situation will never occur. And on the second place, many people say yes. What would be your answer to this poll?
I just really think we have no idea what an equal world looks like because it has never existed. And that is something that's very daunting, but it's still something we need to strive to. I do agree with Rudy that, just having equality or a level playing field or whatever is not going to create an equitable world. So we really have to make sure that that's what we're working on. But yeah, I find it a very hard question because I just have no idea what it would look like. That's it, I think.
All right.
But perhaps coming back to the consumer point, the user point. What I do agree, it's good if we educate people, how to identify fake news, etc. However, at the moment, consumers also don't have any choice. I don't have the choice to go to YouTube and say, hey, please just show me an alphabetical order or whatever. I will only get what is targeted towards me. And also on Facebook, we used to have, of course, the option to show first what was the latest update or last posted. And that has just completely disappeared. So I think creating more choice for consumers is perhaps even more important than educating them.
Yeah. And the final minute.
Okay, well, first of all, if you go back to the Waze example, right? Like the people who were most impacted by this system on surface roads were not users. So it's very important to make sure that we do not collapse citizenship or claims of people, regardless of whether they have citizenship, to user them, because that would be creating an inequality that we do not want to have. With respect to a utopian view of a world without inequality, I think inequality is not a state. It's something we aspire towards. So it's clearly we don't know what it looks like, but we'll hopefully find out. And I would take a historic view on inequality and consider the damage that has been made throughout history to certain parts of the world and certain populations, and think about how we can repair. So I would think that if we want to have a great vision of the future, we need to look at the past and see what mistakes have we done. Who are the people that are most impacted? What are the institutions that can make a change? And how do we ensure that when technology comes to these institutions, they're there to repair and make the world better, rather than to hollow out the institutions and make those kind of claims impossible? So that would be what I would look forward to.
Wow. And with these hopeful, optimistic words coming from the TU Delft, SEDA, thank you so much. Also, big thank you to Kim van SPARRENTAK and Rudy van BELKOM. Thank you for joining this panel. I've learned a lot. I've actually changed some of my view on this topic, so thank you all. And thank you for watching and participating at home. If you already have a ticket for the online conference Brave New World, I would say stick around because the program will recommence at 12:30 with the official program. If you don't have a ticket yet, you still can buy one. Yes, you just go to bravenewworld.nl and purchase your ticket to get more of these conversations, more on the topic of the future of inequality. It's a 2-day conference. Tomorrow we'll talk about spaceship humanity. So it's going to be great. Again, thank you for being part of Brave New World. I also have a little present for you that I can give away. Because thanks to our collaboration with the European Parliament, I can give away a ticket, a code for a fascinating story. It's a movie on inequality. It's called Sami Blood. And you can see, I think, on the screen right now, if you go to watch.leideninternationalfilmfestival.nl and use the code Sami Blood BNW 2020, you have your free pass to watch this incredible movie. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you soon. Bye.